Good evening and welcome. Sorry for the wait. It's very nice to see so many old and new friends. My name is Alessandro Cassin. I'm the Deputy Director at Centro Primo Levi. I'm delighted to host this evening of literature with Ann Goldstein, whose work of 13 years has given American readers access to Primo Levi's complete works, and Jhumpa Lahiri, who lives across languages and has recently adopted Italian as one more literary voice to her arsenal. Translation, multilingualism, identity, and Italian culture lie at the heart of a center's activity, and this evening, dedicated to Elena Ferrante, brings them together in a unique way. I wish to thank our friends at the American Sephardi Federation for co-presenting this program with us. I'm especially grateful to the Center for Fiction and its director, Noreen Tomasi, for partnering with us on a series of programs promoting Primo Levi's complete works. A month ago, the Center for Fiction hosted us in the beautiful hall of the former Mercantile Library for a reading of one of Levi's scientific tales. Today we're here at the Center for Jewish History for yet another evening of literature. After the program, please feel free to join us for a glass of wine in the Steinberg Hall and to browse books from all our organizations, including Centro Primo Levi's publishing house, Europapa Editions. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Noreen Tomasi, Executive Director of the Center for Fiction, who has conceived tonight's event. Enjoy the evening, and please remember to silence your phone. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm not Elena Ferrante, sadly. Sadly, I know you're all upset about that. I'd like to thank a few people. I'd first like to thank Natalia Indrimi of the Centro Primo Levi, who was immediately responsive when we approached her seeking a larger venue for this event. She and her team have been a joy to work with, and we are honored to co-present this evening in partnership with them and with the American Sephardi Federation in this beautiful space. I'd also like to thank Michael Reynolds and everyone at Europa Editions for bringing Elena Ferrante and so many wonderful writers from around the world to American readers. Our speakers this evening are Jhumpa Lahiri and Ann Goldstein, as you know. Jhumpa Lahiri is the author of 4 works of fiction, Interpreter of Maladies, The Namesake, The Unaccustomed Earth, and The Lowland. Her first work of nonfiction, In Other Words, originally written in Italian and translated by Ann Goldstein, is forthcoming from Knopf in 2016. She has received numerous awards, including the Penn Hemingway Award, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, the Premio Gregor von Razzori, etc. She was awarded a 2014 National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama. Ann Goldstein is an editor at The New Yorker. She has translated the works of many of Italy's most prominent writers, including Elena Ferrante, Primo Levi, Giacomo Leopardi, Aldo Buzzi, and Alessandro Piperno, and is editor of the new 3-volume complete works of Primo Levi, published by Liveright this fall. I think Jhumpa Lahiri was probably speaking for many of us in this room tonight when she wrote, "The Neapolitan novel cycle is an unconditional masterpiece." And I know many of us have shared her experience of the book as she describes it, saying, "I read all the books in a state of immersion. I was totally enthralled. There was nothing else I wanted to do except follow the lives of Lila and Lenu to the end." We feel especially lucky to have such a distinguished writer and one who has immersed herself so deeply in Ferrante's work here tonight in conversation with Ann Goldstein, who has so beautifully and expertly translated these wonderful novels. In her book, Why Translation Matters, translator Edith Grossman writes, "In the act of translating, we struggle to hear the work of an author as profoundly and completely as possible, to discover its linguistic charge, its structural rhythms, its subtle implications and cultural inferences, and all its complexities of meaning. This is a kind of reading, the kind of reading a translator does, as deep as any encounter with a literary text can be. So, a supremely gifted writer and a brilliant translator and reader of the most profound sort, here tonight to read from and talk about the exquisite Neapolitan novels of Elena Ferrante. What could be better? Please join me in welcoming Jhumpa Lahiri and Ann Goldstein.
This is how it works. We're going to start with a reading. Yes. I'm going to read the beginning of My Brilliant Friend in English, and then Jhumpa will read it in Italian. My friendship with Leela began the day we decided to go up the dark stairs that led step after step, flight after flight, to the door of Don Achille's apartment. I remember the violet light of the courtyard, the smells of a warm spring evening. The mothers were making dinner. It was time to go home, but we delayed, challenging each other without ever saying a word, testing our courage. For some time, in school and outside of it, that was what we had been doing. Leela would thrust her hand and then her whole arm into the black mouth of a manhole, and I, in turn, immediately did the same, my heart pounding, hoping that the cockroaches wouldn't run over my skin, that the rats wouldn't bite me. Leela climbed up to Signora Spagnuolo's ground floor window, and hanging from the iron bar that the clothesline was attached to, swung back and forth, then lowered herself down to the sidewalk, and I immediately did the same, although I was afraid of falling and hurting myself. Leela stuck into her skin the rusted safety pin that she had found on the street somewhere, but kept in her pocket like the gift of a fairy godmother. I watched the metal point as it dug a whitish tunnel into her palm, and then when she pulled it out and handed it to me, I did the same.
Thank you all for coming. Buonasera a tutti. I'm going to read this in Italian, ma io chiedo scusa subito a tutti gli italiani che sono venuti e spero che questa lettura sia sopportabile. La volta che Lila e io decidemmo di salire per le scale buie che portavano gradino dietro gradino, rampa dietro rampa, fino alla porta dell'appartamento di Don Achille, cominciò la nostra amicizia. Mi ricordo la luce violacea del cortile, gli odori di una serata tiepida di primavera. Le mamme stavano preparando la cena, era ora di rientrare, ma noi ci attardavamo sottoponendoci per sfida, senza mai rivolgerci la parola, a prove di coraggio. Da qualche tempo dentro e fuori scuola non facevamo che quello. Lila infilava la mano e tutto il braccio nella bocca nera di un tombino e io facevo subito dopo a mia volta col batticuore sperando che gli scarafaggi non mi corressero su per la pelle e i topi non mi mordessero. Lila s'arrampicava fino alla finestra a pianterreno della signora Spagnuolo. S'appendeva alla sbarra di ferro dove passava il filo per stendere i panni, si dondolava, quindi si lasciava andare giù sul marciapiede e io lo facevo subito dopo a mia volta, pur temendo di cadere e farmi male. Lila si infilava sotto pelle la rugginosa spilla francese che aveva trovato per strada non so quando, ma che conservava in tasca come il regalo di una fata. E io osservavo la punta di metallo che le scavava un tunnel biancastro nel palmo e poi quando lei l'estraeva e me la tendeva, facevo lo stesso.
So, I'm going to start by talking about, by talking about what it's like to translate Elena Ferrante, which is in some ways not that different from reading Elena Ferrante, but you have to do it more times. The first book, my first encounter with Ferrante was The Days of Abandonment, her second novel, but her first to be published in English. and it was kind of a violent encounter. It's a book that's probably most of you have read. It's intense, it's gripping, it's almost claustrophobic, and there certainly are scenes in it that are literally claustrophobic. You want to get out of Olga's house and out of her head. As the translator, I had to stay there, even when I would have liked to escape. But there's also a way in which I managed to escape, which is through the words, which is I had to focus on the words, which are, of course, I guess you could say, the building blocks of the sentence and then of the paragraph and of the book. And by concentrating on, by creating, I wouldn't say creating, by making something myself out of those words, I think that I was able to endure the emotional intensity of it. That's a slight exaggeration, but that's basically what it's like. The Neapolitan novels are longer, so it's a longer emotional engagement in a way, perhaps slightly less intense. Well, no, not less intense. And I think that the Ferrante's prose is always very dense, very intense, very forceful. I think that the main difficulty is to maintain the kind of intensity, the forcefulness, the violence sometimes, and keep it in and keep something that sounds right in English, that sounds like English syntax, basically, English structure, English words, because she's really going for something. I mean, she's really, in her sentences, she's really getting at the truth of something, usually. I mean, not every sentence, but that's what she's looking for, kind of, we were talking about authenticity, truth, and you need to maintain a certain intensity to get there. So I think that's what I will say about translation. I was going to talk about meeting Ferrante.
Yes, so I thought I would just start by explaining a little bit how I came to Elena Ferrante, thanks to Michael Reynolds, who's here sitting right in front of me, the editor of Europa Editions here in New York, and Ferrante's publishing house in Italy, EO. In any case, Michael sent me The Days of Abandonment also in English. I was in a phase of my life where I was studying Italian rather intensively, but I was still living in the United States. I'd never spent any significant time in Italy, but I was thinking of making a move there. And anyway, so I read the novel, and immediately afterward, I felt the need to read it in Italian, which, I was developing my skills as a reader in Italian at that time. So I asked Michael, and he sent me the book also in Italian, and so I read it. I read it in English, and then I read it immediately in Italian. And to be honest, it was one of those reading experiences that sort of, it did change my life, in that it pushed me over the edge as a reader in the Italian language, and it was around that time that I stopped reading in English, which is a language I haven't really read in at all in almost 4 years at this point. So I trace this moment, this journey I'm making as a reader, really to her. I mean, to her, a few other authors that I was reading around that time, but she is absolutely there in that group. Fast forward to some years later, I moved to Rome, and I was asked at one point to present Ferrante in some way at an annual literary festival in Rome. It used to be called Masenzio, and now it's not in Masenzio anymore. But anyway, it's this thing that happens every June. And I wondered how to go about this, how to talk about a writer who had changed my life, who it had impressed me so deeply, had left such a mark on me, both in terms of her language and in terms of everything her books were doing and saying to me, because I read The Days of Abandonment, and I read the other books that were available at the time. So I decided to write 2 letters to her, because I felt this was the only way I could express what the effect that she had on me as a reader. I'm not an academic. I didn't feel comfortable making a more formal presentation about her work. So I wrote her 2 letters that I read subsequently out loud. The first letter focused on her, on what everybody talks about, right? Which is her choice as an author to be present solely in terms of her writing, and that she is her writing and nothing more, at least for our consumption, our understanding, our accessibility. And I talked about my increasing admiration for this incredibly radical, in our times, perhaps in any time, choice on her part to not participate in the publication of her books. I wrote this letter in a moment when I found myself on a long path of promoting one of my books, and what she had done spoke to me with increasing resonance. And I actually wrote my first letter to her while I was in Stockholm, in Sweden, sort of explaining where I was and why I was there, and talking to her about her need, her desire to place herself how and where she does in relation to her public and her image and her lack of image and all of these things. The second letter spoke rather about my reading of her work, and began with The Days of Abandonment and the 3 early novels, which are sort of a piece, one could say, with Amore Molesto, which is, how is it translated? Troubling Love. The Days of Abandonment, and then the Lost Daughter. The Lost Daughter, sorry. So these 3 novels have a certain energy, right? They have a certain concentration, a certain vision, and then, so I had read those, and then when I was in Rome, I started on the cycle of the longer novels, the Neapolitan cycle of books. So the letter, that letter was about my reading of her, and in the letter, which I won't go into in detail, but I sort of tried to touch on some of her, some of the themes that really stood out to me. And among those, I thought we would talk about in the course of the evening. And to really just pull back from everything, I think this is a writer who writes profoundly about literature, about writing and the power of language and of text and of that. And I think that is her whole project. And I think even her, in that sense, my first letter and the second letter are linked because she is implicit in all of this. I feel that all of these things are of a piece, and one thing is dovetailing into another. And I think what she has done as a writer refers to what is happening in her books and describing what her characters are going through and their search for, really for self-definition, for identity, for becoming who they are. So these are very deep, very profound themes in my mind, to my mind. So I talked a little bit about that, and one thing that really struck me was how books are characters in her work, and the way that books have a sort of vital life force, a regenerative force. Books are the means of escape. Books are the means of self, what is the word I'm looking for self-realization, for leaving Naples, for example, education, learning, language, the Italian language as opposed to dialect. All of these things are sort of, there's this incredible casserole of themes that are just stacked so densely, one on top of the other, in at least in my reading of her. So I thought Anne and I could begin talking a little bit, because this interests me as a reader of Ferrante in Italian and not in English. Before I ever read the L'Amica Geniale cycle, another friend of mine in Rome said to me, the only thing you need to know about Ferrante is the word smarginatura, which is a very particular word in Italian, and it has a very interesting way of being translated into English. And I think if we look at this word, and a lot has been written about this word and commented about this word. There's a piece by the writer Maria Pia Amirati, who kind of presents all of Ferrante. The key to all of Ferrante is this word smarginatura, which basically means it has two definitions. One is a typographical definition, which means the S in Italian can sometimes make a word mean more than what it is and sometimes mean not what it is. So this is one of the cases where the S takes away the meaning of the word. So it's the taking away of the margin. It's the bleeding of the margin. And there's an incredible passage in the first book, in L'Amica Geniale, where one of the main characters is experiencing this word. And it's described as a sort of illness, as a condition, as an existential experience and a physical experience. I would like Anne to talk about how she decided to translate this word, because it is, I really feel like it is the word that takes you through all of the books, from the very early books to the very end of the last words that she's written. So I wondered if Anne could talk about encountering that word, first of all, and what you did with it.
It's a hard word to encounter, because it's not a word it's not an everyday word in Italian. And English doesn't have the ability that Italian has to make a negative of a word, to unmargin, for example, or to non-margin. I think it didn't make sense to me to make up a word. So already I had to use two words. And in the end, I translated it as dissolving margins, but I did go through many versions of it, of disintegrating, dissolving, getting rid of. But in the end, I shouldn't say in the end, because when I translated it, I had read only the first passage where she talks about it, which is the only place she talks about it, I think in L'Amica Geniale. It comes up again later in the earthquake when she has these other, Leela has other episodes or other moments where she feels this, where she has this sensation. But anyway, I didn't know that at the time. So it seemed to describe the sensation, was to say dissolving boundaries, where she's looking at she sees her brother moving into somebody else, and the other people moving, they're losing their edges. And that's what I came up with.
Right, and then the book, the last book in the cycle, contains the word.
It does. It comes back
in the very end, which is really kind of remarkable. It's in the last line, and we'll read the last paragraph at the end of the evening. Ma per darle una forma che non si smargini, which means to give a form that will not have this smarginatura happening, which will remain concrete and distinct and defined. And And it is such an incredible word if you really start meditating on it and unpacking it. And you know, and as I was sort of thinking about what I would talk about today, I mean, on the one hand, the idea of smarginatura, which is this sort of malady, right? It's this sensation, it's this scary feeling of not being yourself, of being part of something else, being swallowed up by something else and not recognizing yourself anymore. So there's this sort of anxiety that it provokes. This idea applies to everything that Elena Ferrante has written, in my opinion, because all of her books are about, you know, the first book is about the search for a mother and the desire to reconnect to the mother who has died, right? Has disappeared and died. Yeah. Then there's the second book is about being abandoned and the terror of that, you know. Also, the woman is dissolving without herself. That boundary of the husband and defining her in some traditional sense. And then the Figlia Oscura is the lost daughter is similarly about a woman who is older and has older daughters, and it's the sort of reversal of this mother-daughter dynamic. I also think it's the idea of life, you know, and it's in its positive and in its negative sense. And I was very struck that in English one does say, I believe, to bleed the margins, which one doesn't say in Italian. If I don't think one uses the same word. You don't say sanguinare, for example, because there's this amazing other word, smarginare. But I think it's fascinating because another lens, a very very deep lens onto Ferrante is certainly the idea of reading her through the idea of the female body and what that means, and maternity and pregnancy and et cetera. And these are big, deep themes that are running through all of her work from the very beginning. In the Neapolitan novels, we have two friends who are pregnant at the same time. They have daughters. There's a daughter who's mistaken for one and for the other. I mean, there are all sorts of strange blurrings and blendings all over the place. And this would be, 12 doctoral theses worth of analysis, which I'm not going to try to, I can't possibly articulate clearly here tonight. But it is an amazing word. And I think it's just one of the keys, right? It's one of the keys to opening up the work of this extraordinary writer. So there's sort of the body metaphor, right, in all of its spokes, everything it radiates. But there's also this idea of, I think, what's so fascinating is about language and the word and the text and how books, at a certain point toward the end of the whole cycle, what is it that remains concrete? It's language, it's text, it's the book. And it's nothing else in life, because everything else in life, everything are subject to these forces of smarginatura, and we don't know where we begin and where we end and how we blur into other things. And so I think there's a very interesting dichotomy, between what is concrete, what is specific, what cannot be what is the word? I mean, what remains intact, as opposed to what can't, and life can't, in a way. And I think, this leads me to another of these ideas that we had wanted to talk about, is the idea of separation, which is the opposite of the blending, right? It's the flip side of this sort of terrifying blurring and blending impulse in the world, in the universe, that makes us confused and makes us scared. And the idea of separation, I think, is one of the driving forces, in all of the books. I wondered if Anne could comment a little bit on
how you
We
perceive that in your
I
reading.
mean, well, the obvious separation is the wish of Elena to separate from her family, to separate from her city, her background, her roots, so to speak. I think that's the driving force of separation for her. And yet, can she separate? Hard to say. I don't think she really does. But that's one of the main separations that are going on. To go back to your theme of books, I mean, books are the way that she separates herself from her family. I mean, by going to school, by studying, by reading and studying, going to Pisa, going to the university in the north, and then by writing a book. So writing the book really at least she thinks it's very much separates her from, I mean, no one would ever have thought of writing a book in the Naples of her neighborhood. And so I was also thinking that her second book is what separates her from her marriage. And so these books are really crucial to her, this whole words, language. I mean, that's one of the roles of the books, also one of the roles of the books as characters, in a way. Language is another separating factor. The language, Italian and dialect, those are two different languages. And she talks a lot about that. I mean, she doesn't actually write, Ferrante doesn't write in dialect. She says, so-and-so said in dialect, so you're not missing anything. But what Jhumpa was saying before, that her not using dialect is making a statement, is a kind of obliteration of it, is what you want to take that up.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe that's not quite where you
the
wanted to go.
idea of dialect versus, I mean, all the books are written in Italian. Everything is happening in Italian. And then, I mean, for anyone who's read, you see there are moments when the characters say something in Italian on the page, she said in dialect, or at this point we started speaking in dialect. But we as the reader are not privy to the dialect. I mean, even if we knew the dialect, we would have to imagine it, because it's not rendered, it's not presented to us. And I find this a very interesting choice on her part, the uniformity of the insistence on having everything in Italian and not having dialect in the text itself, but constantly pointing an arrow to it at the same time, saying it's there, but it's not there. It's not there, and in a way, I feel like the author is the equivalent of that. You know, she's there, but she's never there, and we don't know who she is. But she's always there. She's the current that's underneath everything. You know, she is the writer, and so I think of the dialect as a very interesting way of looking at Ferrante herself and her choice, her positioning in vis-a-vis her writing.
You think it's like a serious separation from her? I mean, assuming that she's from Naples, that as a writer, that's her way of separating from her.
Well, I don't know.
From her parent. I mean, or let's say not Ferrante, but Elena. It's her way of separating from her family.
Yes, I can't. You know, I don't want to speak about someone we don't know, but
I mean of the character.
But yes, for Elena, absolutely. In the book, the Elena of the book is, I mean, she comes from that world, you know, and dialect is for her the lingua madre, the source, the point of origin, right? And then she sort of digs her way out of that by means of Italian, and she talks about this a lot, especially in the first book of the cycle. And I wrote about this in my letter to her because it struck me deeply, because of course I was writing these letters to her in Italian, and I too was making this strange passage from one language to another. Perhaps the passage from dialect to Italian is not as radical as coming from English into Italian, but in any case, there were so many things when she wrote about that, when she wrote about her. I mean, I think it speaks to anybody who lives between and among languages. I mean, she writes about Elena writes about, the character Elena writes about her embarrassment, her deep embarrassment, listening to her mother speaking in her broken dialect and how this was mortifying for her. And of course, this pushed all these buttons in me of my own childhood and my experience of, you know, wanting to run away and hide when my parents were speaking another language in public. Because it marked us and it marked me and all of these things. And these characters are coming very much from that world where they want, I mean, these, you know, if you just look at it as from a, you know, what are these books about? I mean, at least the Neapolitan cycle. I mean, it's about two women, or perhaps one woman, because there's this smarginatura happening even between the two main characters, right? Where one is the other and the other is the one, and one is always behind the other. I don't know if you, you know, as Anne was reading, you know, one is always behind the other. One is always undoing the other. One does something, the other does the opposite, or one does the same thing. They practically have the same name. They're interchangeable. I mean, they're this fused unit, and one doesn't know as one reads where one begins and where the other, where one ends and where the other begins. So there's the idea of smarginatura is very much the definition of their very relationship, right? And the end of the whole cycle ends right on that point. But what I was saying about, now I don't know what I was saying. About what was I saying? About language.
Language and
no, I think.
sorry.
No, it's just it's so no. What I was saying is that these are women, one woman or two versions of one, however you want to look at it, who are looking for independence rather than the state of fusion. But what is the price for that independence? What is the price for liberty? What is the price of defining yourself away from the rione, from the world, from the language, from the place and the people who have made you and define you forever and will never let you go? And what is the journey of the person who wants out? Right, who wants, and what is conversely the destiny of that person who doesn't and who stays. And so here you have the one friend who goes away, who gets out, who writes, who leaves, who travels, who does all of these things, who becomes very successful as a writer, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the one who never leaves, but in a way is never there, you know, and she disappears and she slips away, and she's mysterious, and she's I mean, this is turning back to the sort of bodily metaphor, but she's someone who is literally bleeding in the book, right? And she, toward the end of the cycle, she's ill, and there's all of this interesting emphasis, I think, on her, you know, the life just draining through her, and it's very striking, you know. And I think these are all big dissertation topic types of themes, but they are really fascinating when you think about the project of, you know, you think about things like maternity, fertility, creativity. All of these things are like links in a chain for me as I read Elena Ferrante. I think it's interesting from the female point of view just to think about success, literary success, what that means in these books. You know, so one of the friends becomes incredibly successful, right? And she writes about Naples, and she's made her fame and fortune based on the world she comes from, even though she gets out, and she then has a forever ambivalent, fraught relationship, and the book is full of coming and going, and I'm getting out of here, and me ne vado, and no, then now I'm going back, and no, okay, and I feel guilty, and my mother's sick, I have to go back, you know, so it's like constant push and pull, attraction, repulsion from that source of what has made her. But there's some very interesting passages toward the end of the fourth book about, you know, I mean, her friend Lila is disparaging of her writing, of everything writing is, what a writer does is fake. It's a form of betrayal, and she's very harsh about all of that.
Except at the point where she thinks that the writing can help her in the neighborhood. I mean, there is this whole. I mean, Lila does. She stays in the neighborhood, but she becomes a kind of a force in the neighborhood. I mean, she also becomes successful in a certain sense. I mean, with
she's also a writer. That's the fascinating thing. She's an amazing writer, and not only she's a writer, but she's the rival.
She's the inspiration, in a certain sense, the inspiration of Lanou's writing. But she expresses it in a different way. I mean, Lanou is confused about where her writing comes from in a way, but Lila is the source of it, and she doesn't actually write. I mean, she stays in the neighborhood. She controls the neighborhood, or she tries to control the neighborhood, and then she thinks that Elena can help her control the neighborhood through writing, and she's deeply disappointed by that because her writing can't.
But there's an amazing thing she does at the end of this whole cycle, which is Lila, which is she does research.
Yeah.
She researches Naples. And I found that passage, that portion of the book, one of the most amazing parts of the whole thing. It's an incredible, I don't know, it's like 5 or 6 pages where she's describing, she goes completely, she submerges herself into researching her city and really trying to understand her city. And the whole thing is rendered orally to the daughter of her friend. So it's the storyteller's impulse coming out inevitably, not in writing, but in the telling. And it just adds an element of richness to this novel that I wasn't expecting at all. And I was really sort of undone by its power.
Because it also has this huge metaphoric power, I mean, of decay and building up and destruction, and then something beautiful is built and destroyed, and it just seems like there's a whole flow in that sense too of that historical part.
I was very. I formed some of my thoughts. I would like to just cite a friend of mine who is a professor of contemporary Italian literature at Siena, at the University per Stranieri di Siena. Her name is Tiziana De Rogatis. She's from Naples, and she works on Ferrante. And she's written a series of very interesting articles, if anybody is interested, on Elena Ferrante, and working mainly from the idea, very much from a kind of psychoanalytic reading point of view, which I think merits. I think the work merits that. That's not all that it's about, but I think there are deep elements, shall we say. But she really looks at it through the filter of mythology. And so one of the things that opened up for me reading some of her commentary on Ferrante was the idea of the Persephone myth, Demeter and Persephone, the mother-daughter, that myth as being a kind of cornerstone and a point of referral continually for Ferrante, beginning with Amore Molesto, in which it's kind of a reversal because it's the daughter looking for the mother and not the other way around. And then, of course, in the Neapolitan novels, you have mothers looking for their children on various levels, real and more emotional levels, shall we say. And the anger of the mother, the character, all of the mothers, all the books have mothers. That's just, needless to say, every book has a mother.
Most of them have dolls.
And many of them have dolls. There are a lot of dolls, and there are a lot of daughters.
Yeah.
And so the mother-daughter bond, I think, is, again, like Smarginatura, to me, it's one of those sort of basic ganci, you hold on to that, and you see everything starts opening up by means of this, it starts to open up all sorts of pathways, I think, in how we can read these works. What else?
Can you talk a little more about Persephone?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know how everyone, in a way I don't want to talk too much about what happens in terms of the plot, because it really is so powerful when it does happen. But there is, I mean, again, to go back to the idea of smarginatura, what is it? It's fusion. What is fusion? It's how life begins. You're fused with your mother. You're inside, and you are not her, and she is not herself anymore, because you are this entity, right? That is how all life begins, and I think this is something that Ferrante is looking at very carefully and very subtly on many levels, and her plots, her characters, the movement, the arc, the energy of these books, that is throughout. I don't think you can escape this idea of this fusion that is both, as I say, I think a life force, what is the force that gives life, but it's also the suffocating nature of life, and especially that mother-daughter bond, which is famously suffocating. You know, and certainly in Ferrante we see that, and the mother is not only the literal mother, the mother is also Naples, the mother is also dialect. I mean, there's something that Ferrante herself says in the Frantumalia, which is a series of her letters and some essays and interviews and things, a sort of anthology, and actually Tiziana De Rogatis cites it, talking about Naples. This is Ferrante on Naples, saying it's not a place, it's a prolungamento del corpo, so it's an extension of the body, you know, and so that really fuses, I think for me as a reader, the idea of you have the mother, you have the city, you have the point of origin. They're interchangeable, like so many other things in these novels, in these books. Things are what they are and what they're not. Things are fluid, things are interchangeable, and then there are these violent moments of death, of abandonment, of recreation, of willful reinvention that break the scheme and then change the panorama, you know. But I think so many of her characters, her female characters, are struggling with this, are struggling for self-definition, struggling for their own, maintaining their limits in some sense, and resisting this sort of force that is blurring away at that. And so I think the Persephone myth is very potent in that sense, because there's the idea of separation, of the pain of separation, and this idea also of return, right? The going away, the return, and this sort of cyclical idea that we have from the myth. The underworld, right? I mean, in the book opens, you know, they're sticking their hand into the manhole, and what are they getting? What are they picking up out of there? I mean, that's the impulse, you know. That's something's always, the doll falls down the stairwell. It's these dark places that there's a lot of falling in these books. When Lila has her first episode of smarginatura, she thinks of her father, right, who falls out the window, right, or off the balcony or something. He throws himself off. So there are all these falling down into the rabbit hole kinds of images in the books. What else? What is in our list of topics?
Well, if we could talk just in the specific sense of the mother-daughter. Or should we move on?
Well, mothers and daughters are endlessly fascinating.
Endlessly fascinating. I mean, there are many examples, many concrete examples of the interactions between mothers and daughters. fears, there's the literal dissolving of boundaries where Elena feels that her mother limps, and she feels that she is going to have she actually in the end does end up limping, but she's terrified of having her mother's limp, of being her mother. I was thinking of this when you were talking about how there's the idea of you're starting out in your mother's womb, you separate, but how much do you really separate? I mean, there's always this
well, you can't.
difficulty.
That's
You can't.
That's the anguish.
Right, and she
no matter how far you run away.
Right, but there's that sort of she makes this physical link between Elena and her mother.
Yeah, maybe this is actually an interesting point of juncture to just talk a little bit about. I mean, I know there are many people in this room who could speak more intelligently about this than I can, but I do feel that it is worth just throwing out, just to place Ferrante in a context, an Italian context a little bit.
Yeah.
Just from my own reading of Italian literature, which is, it is what it is, and it's has many holes and spots and things, but I do think there are a couple of authors that come to mind for me, female authors who write about mothers and daughters in very interesting ways, and I think that Ferrante is absolutely sort of, it's interesting to look at her work, and as what I'm trying to say, and also referring back to other works. I mean, everybody is really struck, I think, in the United States about some of her themes and these sort of, oh my God, like Days of Abandonment, and it's so kind of a slap in the face, and this is, but I mean, there's a very slim novel called È stato così by Natalia Ginzburg, where you have a mother, you have a child, you have a husband, and again, I don't want to give away plots of everything, but you have a very sort of disturbing situation, shall we say, based on motherhood. There's a novel by Lalla Romano called Le parole tra noi leggere, which is another incredible portrait of a very deeply problematic mother. I was struck, just this is personally, so I wrote this novel where a mother leaves her child at a certain point. And I was surprised by the reactions to this plot element. I wasn't expecting it. Maybe because I had read a lot of Ferrante, and maybe because I had, I don't know, read a lot of Greek tragedy or something, but to me, it didn't seem like the craziest thing in the world that a mother would leave her child. Ferrante's mothers are leaving their children all over the place in all sorts of ways. And so I wrote to her about this. I said, I'm constantly being, condemned by people at dinner parties saying, how could you write this about this person? And that's fine. That's their opinion, and I respect people's opinions. But if you read other books by other Italian writers, is my point, especially some of these female writers that I'm mentioning, Natalia Ginzburg, Morante, Elsa Morante, where the mother figure is mythical. Also, Romano, who's a lesser-known writer perhaps, but has written this incredibly potent novel about motherhood, and was herself a writer who basically, I know a little bit about her biography, but just basically cut off her relationship with her son for reasons I don't need to explain here. But so I just think it's an interesting, just to pull back a little bit from what Ferrante has done, what she has given us. It's an incredibly wealthy world of just writing themes, and I have just profound admiration for what she's done. But I think it's also interesting to pull back and look at other, this panorama of mother-daughter relationships, portraits of mothers in other Italian 20th century literature and other centuries as well, but certainly these writers that I mentioned are from the 20th century. I think another writer, woman author to think about is Anna Maria Ortese, who was from Naples, and her vision of Naples, you know, as a place, the power of the city. I think there's a lot of what Ferrante is articulating. I see parallels in her works as well. And the idea of smarginatura, you know, as you know, Naples sort of provokes it. The city itself provokes this sort of, you know, it's devouring you, and you have to get away from it, right? Because otherwise it's going to encompass you, it's going to swallow you up. The metaphor of the volcano, everything, the nature of it, the natural, physical aspect of it, and what happened there, and that history always there and always in view as you're walking around doing your things, and you see Vesuvius, and you are aware of that, and her characters are deeply aware of that. So,
well, the big episode of Smarginatura is during the earthquake, where it's sort of a physical representation of what's happening to her mentally, to Lila, and it sort of fits in with what you were saying. I mean, it's the place. It's the place. Can do this to you. I mean, that isn't what she's saying, but it sort of represents what's going on in her mind. Is this earthquake? Everybody's going by. There's no differentiation. The streets, the sidewalks, the buildings, things are inside or outside. It's a powerful image, as well as a physical thing, event.
And again, just to go back to everyone's favorite topic of who is Ferrante, you know, so I wrote her these letters. I mean, I wrote her these letters that were read out loud, right, in public and shared. But somehow the letters reached her, and she wrote me back, which was really extraordinary. And she wrote me a beautiful letter, you know, and a lot of it was about her, I mean, in a way it's almost a kind of a manifesto, what she sent, a personal manifesto, emphasizing, underscoring her position vis-a-vis her writing, her refusal to have smarginatura happen to her, right? To remain intact, and to refuse what she calls the ingranaggio, the mechanism of publishing and everything, to, you know, this blurring, the problematic blurring we have now between the work and the author's life, and the life is the author's work, and vice versa, and this endless horrible cycle that is just so diffuse and you know, can be so frustrating for those who write. And her letter is very much about that. Her letter is very much about saying, I refuse to participate in this. And, you know, and she says at one point, in bianco e nero, very clearly, in black and white, chi vuole sapere di me in quanto autrice non deve uscire dal recinto del mio testo, deve leggermi. Io sono la mia scrittura. So it would be, who wants to know me as an author does not have to go out of the barrier, the enclosure of my text. They have to read me. I am my writing. And this is really fascinating, because in a way it turns the tables on this whole idea of smarginatura, because on the one hand she's saying, no smarginatura for me, thank you very much. You know, no book tour, no interviews, no physical photos and things like that. So we remain pure, you know. But then this amazing, io sono la mia scrittura, I am my writing. And that is smarginatura, because she and her writing are the same thing. And I think any writer feels that. I think any writer, I mean, I feel that. I feel like and I write this in my new book. I mean, I say it in as many words. I say, the words are me and I become the words. And that is the state, the pure state of writing. You write in order to arrive at that, at least I do, to arrive at that state where you are nothing but your words and you are obliterated. But you become the words, and there's this fusion. So I found this moment in the letter really kind of fascinating, because she's sort of saying, on the one hand, you know, she's pushing this marginatura force away with one hand, and then she's, by means of that, by means of pushing all the noise, all the glare, all the lights, all the traveling, all the blah, blah, blah away, saying, no, I will not allow that to I will not trespass, I will not allow that to come in and swallow me up, right? And as a result of that, she can attain this state of bliss as a writer, of becoming her words, and her words becoming her. But I think that contradiction is it's very rich, it's very beautiful to me.
So I think we need to read by reading a passage from the end of the last book.
Should we introduce it a little bit, or yeah?
Sure. If I can find it. Yeah. Well, it's the end of the book. It's actually, it's before the epilogue. It's about, she's talking about the book that she's written called A Friendship, Un'amicizia, and she's never heard from Lila after that. Elena has never heard from Lila after that. And I think that's what she's talking about here, is the book, and then she sort of sums up her relationship, really, their relationship. So I guess I'll read it in English first. She refers to hypotheses about why Lila has never said anything to her, because she hates it, because she loves it, because she can't stand it, because she used the facts of their life in her book. But anyway, she says, I am merely piecing together hypotheses. I would have to confront her, hear her protests, explain myself. Sometimes I feel guilty, and I understand her. Sometimes I hate her for this decision to cut me off so sharply right now, in old age, when we are in need of closeness and solidarity. She has always acted like that. When I don't submit, see how she excludes me, punishes me, ruins even my pleasure in having written a good book. I'm exasperated. Even this staging of her own disappearance, besides worrying me, irritates me. Maybe little Tina has nothing to do with it, maybe not even her ghost, which continues to obsess Lila, both in the more enduring form of the child of nearly 4 and in the labile form of the woman who today, like Emma, would be 30. It's only and always the two of us who are involved. She who wants me to give what her nature and circumstances kept her from giving. I who can't give what she demands. She who gets angry at my inadequacy and out of spite wants to reduce me to nothing, as she has done with herself. I who have written for months and months and months to give her a form whose margins won't dissolve, and to feed her and calm her, and so in turn calm myself.
So now I will read di nuovo, scusatemi, but before I read in Italian, I just wanted to say just two quick things. One is another author, I think, who belongs perhaps just looking at Ferrante, just opening up the context. She's not an Italian writer, but she's a writer I discovered while living in Italy, and I read her in Italian in translation, and that is Agota Christoph, who is a writer of Hungarian origin, who wrote in French and wrote, I think, one of the most powerful trilogies in existence, called the Trilogy of the City K, I think it is called in English. But she is a writer who is really looking at the idea of real life, fiction, this blending, marginatura, to again cite the term of reality and fiction in ways that are incredibly sophisticated, incredibly complex, remarkable. I mean, I recommend her to everyone. Extraordinarily powerful, disturbing writer. And when I was finishing up the tetralogia, the how do you say it, the tetralogy, sorry, the tetralogy, I was thinking a lot about her. I was thinking a lot about Agatha Christoph as well. Not so much in terms of the maternal element, the portrait of mothers, though there are mothers in those books as well. But particularly something I think, and again, we don't have time to go into it, but I think one of Ferrante's projects, what she's investigating is the idea of life and the created work, real life and the invented life, our origins and what we become and whom we become. So there's kind of the textual metaphor and the real life metaphor of it, and just looking at, and I think she herself, she talks about, one of the things she talks about in my letters is, writing as being something inherently artificial that has to render reality, right? And this has been the challenge for all writers from the beginning. And she rightly refers to this struggle and this sort of magic act that writers perform. And I think it's particularly relevant in a world in which, again, reality and fiction is constantly being mistaken one for the other. And there's no escape at this point. I mean, there's no escape between writing a book and talking about who wrote it and wondering about who wrote it and talking about the person's life and this whole thing of, endless back and forth, which she refuses to participate in. But I think in her work, in the novels, she's working this out, and I think the way that her characters react to real life stories rendered into fiction and all of the complexity that involves is really fascinating. So that's one thing I wanted to just add. And then the other thing is that this passage that I'm about to read does have, not only does it have the verb smarginare in the very last sentence, but it also is really amazing because it ends with the words "e così a mia volta," and so in turn, which is the way the whole saga opens. And in fact, if you listening to Anne and to me, I mean, she uses the same "a mia volta," speaking of Lenu, twice, which is, I think, no writer uses the same word twice in one paragraph without wanting to. And so I think this is very interesting because she's again just sort of, her final note is just with that idea of the blending, the interwoven nature of this friendship, and the way they're sort of, they come from one another and they hate each other and they destroy each other over the course of the years, and devour each other and so on. But also I was very struck looking at the passages we were asked to read that this same "a mia volta" is present in the beginning and again at the very end. So this is my rendering of the Italian. Ma sto mettendo insieme solo ipotesi. Avrei bisogno di confrontarmi con lei, ascoltare le sue rimostranze, spiegarmi. A tratti mi sento in colpa e la capisco. A tratti la detesto per questa sua scelta di tagliarmi via da sé così nettamente proprio adesso, in vecchiaia, quando avremmo bisogno di vicinanza e solidarietà. Ha fatto sempre così. Quando non mi piego, ecco che mi esclude, ecco che mi punisce, ecco che mi guasta il piacere stesso di aver scritto un buon libro. Sono esasperata. Anche questo suo mettere in scena la propria cancellazione, oltre che preoccuparmi, mi indispettisce. Forse la piccola Tina non c'entra, forse non c'entra nemmeno il suo fantasma, che continua a ossessionarla sia nella forma della bambina di quasi 4 anni, la più resistente, sia nella forma labile della donna che oggi, come Imma, avrebbe 30 anni. C'entriamo sempre e soltanto noi due. Lei che vuole che io dia ciò che la sua natura e le circostanze le hanno impedito di dare, io che non riesco a dare ciò che lei pretende, lei che si arrabbia per la mia insufficienza e per ripicca vuole ridurmi a niente come ha fatto con se stessa, io che ho scritto mesi e mesi e mesi per darle una forma che non si smargini e batterla e calmarla e così a mia volta calmarmi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.